Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining today's session. We're really excited to have you all here. Today, we're going to be kicking off our second mini research-based topic on literacy. This is one of a few opportunities that we're rolling out this summer to provide you all with a snapshot on how kids learn to read. This will also provide you with some initial foundation for preparing for the Strong Foundations Framework Development Grant, if you do choose to apply. If you just joined, please change your name so that you have your organization in front of your name. You can look at my Zoom example or Matt's. And then also, if you could just give a small greeting in the chat. All right, so if we go ahead and advance Matt to introductions. So just to give you a quick introduction, my name is Leslie Cuellar. I am the high quality instructional materials recruiting lead here at TEA. I actually work with the team that is rolling out this grant, so you might be seeing my face or several emails as we move forward with this grant. I am happy to be here and happy to be a support as we move forward with this grant. So Matt, if you'd like to do a quick intro.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to connect with you today. My name is Matt Pearson. I'm a director at TNTP. We are partnering with TEA to do trainings in the research-based instructional strategies both this summer and develop some new ones for next school year. And so I'm really looking forward to diving into what does the research show us are some best practices for students to learn in K through 12 in literacy. So thanks for being here.
Awesome. So to get started, we're just going to do a quick recap on some of the upcoming opportunities for the Strong Foundations Development Grant. So as you see here, there are still many ways that you can learn more about this grant and its goals. We held our first district panel on Tuesday with Aldine ISD, where they shared a couple of examples of their work as they were undergone some of this framework development process. We do have a couple of opportunities happening in July and August. And so this is a great way for you all to learn from other districts about why they invested in this work. They'll be talking about some of their successes and challenges and really how the framework development process has helped them to better serve their students. And also, just in case you missed yesterday's session on math research-based instructional strategies, our next session will happen on July 18th. So if you missed that opportunity, please register. And then lastly, we do hold some one-on-one 30-minute sessions with districts. So if you do have any questions or you want to talk about your local context and really figure out if this support is right for you, we are more happy to explore this with you all. And so I will be dropping a link here in a bit with the website information that contains all these opportunities so that you can look through it and then register as you need. So if we can go ahead and move on to the next slide, we'll just go ahead and get started with an overview of why we're here today. So the purpose of this session is to provide you all who are interested in this grant an opportunity to learn about the research on how kids learn to read. And also it'll give you a small glimpse on what your LEA will be engaging in throughout the Strong Foundations Development Grant, and specifically in the collective learning series of this grant. So your district committee will actually be doing a deeper dive into the research on how kids learn to read. So again, we just want to give you guys just a short glimpse of what that looks like. And so just to reiterate that just again on the next slide, there's this roadmap that we have that we shared with you all in the webinar that was held for districts on Monday. And so this is the third step of a five-step framework development process. And again, your district committee will be developing a collective learning scope and sequence that is focused on research on math and or literacy. So again, the session, we just want to emphasize the research on how kids learn to read, and Matt will be taking us through more of this throughout the session. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt.
All right, thank you so much, Leslie. Oops, let me back up. So here's what we're gonna do today. We're going to introduce what are the research-based instructional strategies for reading skills. You can see 4 of them here. We're gonna give you an overview of each, an example of what it looks like, have a couple opportunities to reflect and engage with them so that you can have a clear understanding of what is this research-based instructional strategy. So foundational skills, text complexity, knowledge coherence, and text-based responses. And I wanted to share a little bit about our session norms. So thank you for being fully present. We're going to use breakout rooms a little later. So I'll remind us when we get to that point. We're going to use the chat to kind of get a read of the room. And also that's a great place for parking lot if you've got longer questions related to something that comes up here. And so I'm excited to share the research here and looking forward to giving you an overview of what the literacy work looks like. So let's start off with the why. Right? Let me pause here. I want you to take a minute to read through this question, or excuse me, this quote from research on why we need to give more students the right opportunities because the stakes are high. Take a minute to read this quote, and then I'm going to have you share a reflection in a second. Let's pause for a minute. As you're reading this quote, I would love for you to put in the chat, what is resonating with you about this quote? This helps ground us in why are we even focusing on research-based strategies to improve literacy outcomes? What is standing out to you? What's resonating with you? What idea is really making a connection for you right now? Please type that in the chat. Love to get a read of the room. And as those reflections are coming in, all too often the disparities that this research is highlighting here impact students who have been traditionally underserved by our public education system. And we're going to explore what practices throughout this little series here will help us. But if you are supporting a student population that lives in poverty or is a community of color or has an emerging bilingual student or a student with learning and thinking differences, unfortunately, as of now, you're less likely to get the right opportunities in literacy instruction, and you're more likely to end up not reading on grade level. And everything that the data and research up there shows in terms of predicting future outcomes. So this is why RBIS? Because we know that the ability to read and all the skills that come with it set students on a path to be able to be the authors of their own story in life. And unfortunately, we know, looking at this, since the 1990s, that more than 60% of American fourth graders are not proficient readers. It means more than 60% of students are more likely to have those disparities that the research quote calls out here. Let me get a read of the chat and see what's resonating with folks here. Yes, yeah, it's critical to student success, quality of life. Yeah. And boy, some great reflections here. Unfortunately, if there is a silver lining, the silver lining is that we know from research some practices to prioritize to help change this current reality. So that's why TEA developed a set of research-based instructional strategies. The acronym is RBIS, which is pronounced just like the fast food chain. So when we say, if you hear me say RBIS, I'm not referring to roast beef and horsey sauce, although that is delicious, but I am referring to the research-based instructional strategies. So let's look at what they are and what they are not. I'm going to pause here and give you a minute to look in the green. You'll see at a high level, what are the research-based instructional strategies? And then in red, what are they not? So take a minute and let's review the bullets under the green side and the bullets under the red side. And then I'm going to have you type a reflection. So as you've scanned this page, what I'd love for you to do is share in the chat. Think about the teachers at the LEA you serve. If you were sharing this information with your teachers, which of these bullet points on the green side would resonate most with them? Which of those bullet points on the green side, 1, 2, 3, or 4, would resonate most with your teachers in terms of creating a framework for strong literacy instruction? Go ahead and type in the chat. What would connect with your teachers the most? Yes, I'm seeing connections that this is not a curriculum, right? It's a set of practices. Bullet 4, that these relate directly to the approach required to implement them well, right? That these would resonate with our teachers. When these strategies are being used, learning will be present regardless on the instructional materials. What a great call out. You're going to see as we show you what does each of these look like in practice, we're going to use examples from Texas-based high-quality instructional materials. And that is not because those curriculums are the only place where these research-based instructional strategies show up. They are what we happen to have access to, so it is easier for us to pull examples from and share with you as a guide to illustrate what it looks like. But we know that these are research-based strategies that should be in place regardless of the curriculum that your district currently has or is considering. So I want to name that as we take a look at what these practices are. So when we think about all the different aspects of reading acquisition and how they occur, there are 4 main essential best practices that need to be ingrained in daily literacy instruction to help students develop a deep understanding of literacy and all of its complex strands. These components are, number 1, foundational skills, complex texts, knowledge coherence, and evidence-based responses. So in today's session, we're going to define each of those components, 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to give you an example of what they are, how they differ from our current practices, and then discuss ways in which high-quality instructional materials can make these components come alive with even more effectiveness for our teachers and our learners. Let's put these in context. You know from the Effective Schools Framework and your work at your LEA that the vision of what are highly successful, strong schools and school systems doing to improve outcomes for students contains many parts, but at the heart of it is effective instruction. And we know from this research, what we're going to share with you is what should be present in effective instruction for literacy in particular. And that combined with all these other components and the implementation of these research-based practices, can hit the bullseye for effective instruction. If we successfully implement these strategies and combine them with these other factors here, we know we'll increase achievement for students. So let's start with, how do children learn to read? So in order to understand the importance of why we have research-based instructional strategies for literacy and their impact on student learning, let's start with some foundational theories. This is from the science of reading. So back in 1986, two researchers, Go and Turner, published a theory we call the simple view of reading. It tells us that the amount of words that one can decode, being sound out, multiplied by the amount of language or words they understand the meaning of, so you see the decoding multiplied by, in blue, language comprehension, equals reading comprehension. There you have it, the science of reading. It's more complicated than that. We'll dig into that in the rest of the presentation. This may look familiar because this is a simple view of reading. It tells us that in order for students to comprehend text, they must not only comprehend what the text says in terms of vocabulary and what that means for language comprehension, they have to first be able to decode the words. Decoding words alone won't make a student a strong reader, but being a weak decoder automatically means the student will inevitably be weak in terms of reading comprehension. So before we move forward, I want to point out that this is really the foundation of the science of reading. The other theories and research that we'll share for the other instructional strategies are guided by this. Okay. So let's look at how we learn to read, reading acquisition. And for those of you who have been supporting folks with reading academies, this will look familiar, right? But based on scientific, evidence-based research, reading experts have determined that what students need in order to learn to read and how they best learn. So this body of research is referred to as the science of reading. There's a couple landmark studies that have identified key research-based components of reading instruction and the evidence-based practices that support all students' reading development. So remember, the science of reading isn't a specific curriculum or a specific intervention. It's a framework that describes the components of literacy, such as learning how to access the sounds of language and then map them to print. The science of teaching reading framework can help teachers deliver high-quality, evidence-based instruction that supports literacy in all content areas. And the good news for us is that all of the strategies we're going to look at today, when you break them down, we know that foundational skills multiplied with knowledge coherence and grade level text complexity leads to reading comprehension. So this is how the research-based instructional strategies, the RBIS for reading language arts, fit into the simple view of reading. In your handout, you've got a little space to jot down any reflections or takeaways just initially on the overview here. I'm going to pause for a minute to do that before we move to our first RB, which is foundational skills. And let's dive into our first one, foundational skills. So we're going to focus on what practices, explicit systematic practice, literacy foundational skills connect to this research-based practice. We're going to look at the ladder of reading. 95% of students are neurologically capable of reading by age 8. So if this is true, What does this mean for instruction, how we meet the needs of all students? Look at the ladder of reading graphic here. We know that about 35 to 40% in green up at the top will learn to read with relatively little instruction and few repetitions of phonics skills, etc. There's another 40 to 50%, moving to that next part here, that need systematic, explicit, sequential instruction and how the code on reading English works to help them build their neural pathways between the visual, auditory, and the semantic areas of their brain. And then down towards the bottom there's about 10 to 15% of students who require systematic, sequential instruction in phonics and phonemic awareness and with lots of repetition. These are students that we would consider dyslexic. It's really important to note here, dyslexic doesn't mean that these students can't learn to read. They need more intensive repetition. So the bottom line, as you look at this initial research, this is not a question of students' ability. All students have the ability to learn to read. It is a question of instruction. And the systematic, explicit instruction in phonemic awareness, phonics, and word recognition is the approach that will best support the learning of all students and put them on the path to moving to what this quote outlines, what we know they're neurologically capable of. And I just want to note that the process for foundational skills is the same in Spanish, but it's a little faster due to the transparency of language. So we know that realistically, 95% of our students should be reading well with strong instruction. However, in 2019, and this is before the COVID slide, 35% of fourth graders met or exceeded the NAEP's proficiency bar in 2019. So there's a large gap. There's 60% of students who are neurologically capable of reading, who the research shows us are not yet able to do that. And it's a question of what moves do we prioritize? So let's look at this. We're going to unpack the key terms in this RBIS, starting with systematically, so that we can understand the difference between occasional instruction and systematic instruction. And then we'll dive into explicit and practice. So in order to teach all students to learn how to read, we must use the elements of this first RLA RBIS. That instruction is systematic. It follows an intentional, research-based progression. Instruction is explicit. There are opportunities for students to read, to write, to hear, and to say. And that instruction includes practice in the text, making meaning of what's read. And as we're learning more about these elements, I want you to be thinking about what this means in terms of teacher development and what your role in that could be if this is a framework that you pursue. So here's the reading wars of the 1990s. You might remember this, phonics versus whole language, right? By systematic, we mean instruction that follows an intentional sequence of explicit instruction. It's building from easy to more complex skills and with intentional opportunities for repetition and review. Not all curriculum scope and sequences are systematic. For example, some pick out the phonics by the book rather than by a scope of least to more complex phonics. So contrast that here with the incidental phonics plan, which only highlights phonics instruction when it arises in the text. The consensus in the research, let me share this, is abundantly clear. Systematic phonics instruction produces significant benefits for students, particularly for students who are struggling to learn to read. And you can see that the evidence is so conclusive that the International Education Statistical Association has stopped funding research on this topic because there is so much evidence from this meta-analysis of the significant benefits for students in kindergarten through sixth grade of systematic phonics. Let's look at what that means, what that looks like to have systematic phonics. Practice can be in context through reading a text, and it can also be out of context. And this is also true for both English and Spanish. I want to highlight that Amplify Texas has a Spanish curriculum that has the same types of practice for our emergent bilingual learners. So let's look at what this looks like in execution. Let's look at our practice here. Students should practice the same skills that were explicitly taught in real text. Here's an example from a kindergarten skills unit. So one important element of practice is applying their newly acquired skills to text. So the key here is that students need to practice their newly acquired foundational skills in phonetically controlled texts that require them to decode and not just rely on patterns and pictures. A phonetically controlled or decodable reader has fewer pictures and is less predictable than other readers for young students, since the intent of these is to ask children to attend carefully to the phonetic patterns they've been learning. So here's a sample text connected to a kindergarten lesson. Students have been working on digraphs and have just been introduced to the sound spelling pattern. You can see this text is intentionally designed to have students practice and apply the sound spelling patterns they've learned. The text also provides a review of prior skills and repetition with new and prior skills. So listening to students read decodable text provides valuable information about their mastery of the targeted skill. If students haven't mastered the skill, they will need additional practice. Teachers often use small group time, centers, transition moments to have students practice with those types of readers. And finding the appropriate aligned decodable texts to practice systematic phonics can be very challenging to do on your own. This is one of the benefits of using a high-quality instructional curriculum, is that the curriculum does this work for you. Think about the teachers in your LA and how much time they spend pulling together resources. Let's look at another example. Let's look at the difference between a predictable text and decodable text so you can clearly see the distinction. A predictable text and a decodable text, they're fundamentally different. If you look here, a predictable text has predictable pictures where students fill in missing words with sight words or phrases that students memorize. This doesn't allow much in the way of practice with sounds that students might have just learned. Bring this down so you can see the difference. So I want to talk about 3 cueing methods. Okay, so recall our earlier research that said 95% of students can learn to read by 3rd grade. So why aren't they? What practices are happening in classrooms that prevent students from learning how to read? One of them is a misuse of the 3 cueing method. You can see the 3 cues here. Some instructional programs that don't focus on Tier 1 instruction promote the use of a predictable text and a leveled text, along with encouraging the use of the word to attack strategies that don't require students to read through words. Let me show you an example. I want you to review that chart there. Of that set of strategies related to cueing, which ones would you say are appropriate for students to use when they first encounter an unknown word? I want you to think to yourself, then type in the chat, which of those strategies under ways to take action would be truly appropriate for a student to use when they first are encountering an unknown word? Please put in the chat which strategies you think would be appropriate for a student when they first encounter an unknown word to use. Thank you, Gary. So does it make sense, the word that they're calling? What else? What strategy there would you want students to use when they first encounter an unknown word? Chunky monkey, maybe lips the fish. Get ready for the first sound. Your mouth ready. Eagle eye and chunky monkey. All right, let's do a little reveal. So the two strategies would be stretchy snake and chunky monkey. Additional cues such as pictures or examining the syntax can be used to confirm or support understanding of the meaning of a word, but they shouldn't be used to guess at the word to begin with. Because we want students to focus on decoding, because when they get to longer text, those picture cues and clues will be going away, and they won't be able to rely on them. Check out this research that shows us what do strong readers do and what do weak readers do. I know for me, my background was when I first started teaching was in secondary reading language arts. And I would often have students who would come to me. I remember vividly my first year teaching a student who came to me who was reading at a second grade level. And I did not know yet how to teach that student how to learn to read. I knew about reading to learn. I didn't know the strategies or the research that I should be relying upon. And even now, with my own children, when I'm helping them first look through books, I have them do a picture walk, which is good. But as they go along in their K through 12 journey, they won't be able to rely strictly on picture clues and cues. They need to actually know the code of how do I read. Let's look at what this looks like in kindergarten. So here's kinder level A text. So when you analyze the words, the thinking of familiar sight words and those that are clearly shown through the picture cues, we can see how a young reader might be very successful in reading this text. Here's the problem. By the time they get to third grade, depending on high fluency words and picture cues becomes a real problem. You've heard teachers lament that some of their readers did fine in the early grades, but they lost it all when they got to third grade. Well, decodables are critical for practice and application of phonics, for connecting phonics to reading, and for building fluency. Because simply put, if a reader tried to rely on this picture as a cue and a clue for what the text was telling them, they would not be able to comprehend the passage. Which brings us to a kind of a key idea just to stamp for this part. Decodables are critical for the practice and application of phonics, connecting the phonics to reading, and for building readers' fluency. I'm going to pause on this before we go to our next research-based strategy, text complexity. And I want to give you a minute to jot down your thoughts on your handout digitally or take notes. What is sticking with you from that first research-based practice, foundational skills? Okay, we just talked about foundational literacy. So now let's look at our next research-based practice. Text complexity. So in this one, we're going to focus on what is regular practice with grade level complex texts and its academic language mean? And what does it look like in action? So what makes a text complex? Before I share something from the research here, type in the chat, how would you answer this question? If one of your teachers asked you, hey, I'm not sure if this text is complex enough for my students, what makes a text complex? What would you tell them? What's your initial thought? Go ahead and put it in the chat. Let's pause a minute. Thank you. Complex vocabulary, structure, syntax. This is new learning. This is good. Unfamiliar language, hidden purpose. The sentence structure related to vocabulary. This is good. It's interesting. We're getting a clear trend in the room around the vocabulary. The text. Let's look at some factors from the research. So complex texts are those that provide students opportunities to work with new language, knowledge, and ways of thinking. Here's some characteristics. And this aligns with many of the things you guys just pulled out in the chat. They often contain more implicit meaning and use unconventional structures. Think of how often we've asked students to find the theme or the main idea, and it's not just in a bold heading. They have implicit meaning. They use figurative language, ambiguity, archaic, which ironically can be an archaic word, or unfamiliar language, academic or domain specific. So there's more complex vocabulary, right? You guys called this out. They also assume that the reader has the life experience, either in terms of the culture, literary, and content knowledge, that will contribute to their understanding of the information in the text. They have a literal meaning that is intentionally sometimes at odds with the underlying meaning. So in an informational text, the author's purpose might be implicit or hidden. A simple idea, challenging does not equal complex. So let's look at how do we figure out text complexity. What 3 factors should be our guide then, right? There are many things that we jump to looking for to determine complexity, but they might not provide the whole picture. So to help us better navigate, we should be looking for to determine how complex the text is and what our teachers could be looking for. The RLA TEKS Center uses these 3 measures. They are quantitative dimensions, looking at the factors that impact readability, the lexile levels, for example.
Sorry, I don't have an answer for that.
I apologize. I just said lexile levels. My Alexa came to life. Qualitative dimensions. They examine levels of meaning, the knowledge demands, language features, text structure, and the use of graphics as measured by an attentive reader. And finally, they consider the additional outside factors that might impact the difficulty of reading the text. So these are the 3 key factors when we talk about text complexity, when we want students to be grappling with complex texts. Here are the 3 factors that help us determine, is this text complex and worthy of my students' time? Because the more time students spend with grade level complex texts, the greater achievement in reading comprehension. So let's look at how this works in leveled reading. Let's dig into this deeper and name exactly what we mean by a leveled text and why we should move away from using leveled text as a core method of instruction. Leveled reading is an approach that pairs students with texts that match their reading levels. So when you look at this chart, you can see that third graders who are on a reading level below third grade spend an average of 10 minutes or less daily on grade level texts. Imagine that multiplied over the course of 2 to 3 to 4 years. And when is a third grader reading at first grade level going to get caught up to grade level work? That's part of why, based on if we just stick students in at the leveled reading that pairs them with their current reading levels, but never give them access to grapple with grade level texts, unfortunately, we know from the research, if you're not at grade level by the end of third grade, that it is an incredibly slim chance that you will get to grade level, and it has numerous outcomes for your life that are not positive. So let's look at how we can choose texts that help move there. Often, teachers choose texts based on students' reading level instead of their grade level, even though our standards encourage the opposite. So here you can see, based on a survey from 2018 of reading and writing instruction in America's schools, they asked teachers. So this data asked teachers' practices since the development of standards. It suggests that teachers are increasingly choosing texts based on students' reading levels instead of grade level. And the bottom line is, we may think this data is cut and dry, and that because if we've got a high quality instructional material, we don't need to be talking about complex text anymore, but unfortunately, that's just not the case. We've got to be actively helping all of our teachers understand why grade level texts are so critical for comprehension, so that more teachers choose grade level complex text as their core instruction. Let's look at why. Tier 1 instruction must focus on grade level complexity, but that doesn't mean that students don't read other levels of complexity. So does this mean that we only read grade level text, complex text? No. But in our Tier 1 instruction, the instruction that our students first receive, it must focus on grade level complexity. Close reading is one approach to supporting students with more complex texts, but it will not be enough to make proficient readers out of all students. With close reading, you go deep with a small amount, whereas in volume of reading, you do a huge amount on a wide variety of topics. We simply can't do close reading for everything because it takes too long. If you do only close reading, you won't read enough. So there's a broad spectrum, right? Look at some ways here under Tier 1 instruction. When you look at this, what practices do you feel would benefit your students the most? If one of these were true in Tier 1 instruction, what practice out of that list there do you feel would benefit your students the most when you think about their needs and where they're at? Go ahead and put in the chat, which of those practices under Tier 1 instruction would benefit your scholars the most? Mm-hmm. Grade level starts exposes to, yeah, all of it, yeah. Gives all students access. I'm going to pause here for a minute. We're going to move to our third research-based strategy, knowledge coherence, in a moment. But in your handout, if you want to capture a key idea or takeaway that you had from text complexity, please take a minute to do so. And then we'll move on to our third strategy. Yeah, they're all equally, they are all valuable. So I'm pausing here for a moment. You can capture in your handout. So we're going to move now to our third research-based instructional strategy, knowledge coherence. How do we build knowledge and vocabulary through text in all content areas? Excuse me. So you already know, as we've highlighted earlier, that the RBIS align to the simple view of reading. But when we break that down, we know the foundational skills we've touched on. We've touched on the grade level text complexity. But now, when you multiply those with knowledge coherence and that opportunity to grapple with grade level complex text, that's what's going to lead us to reading comprehension. So let's look at the role background knowledge plays. Studies have shown just how critical background knowledge is. Of course, comprehension is the highest for students who have strong decoding skills and strong knowledge. However, students who have high knowledge but low decoding skills have even higher comprehension than students with low knowledge but high decoding skills. Unfortunately, a student's knowledge is often impacted by their socioeconomic status. So, in 2014, some researchers set out to study how does background knowledge affect pre-K students' comprehension on texts about birds. And what they found were significant gaps between lower and higher socioeconomic status students in their comprehension. However, you can see that picture there. This is a wug. When those same students were given a text about a fictional species called wugs, those gaps in comprehension disappeared. So the driving idea here is that if we level the playing field when it comes to knowledge, we can also level the gaps we see in comprehension. Because what we know is that knowledge builds schema. Think about any topic that you built a strong schema around is much more likely to catch similar applicable knowledge. We're using the analogy here of a spider's web because knowledge building helps comprehension. It adds to our schema or our mind map of related knowledge and experience. We use our schema and the associations within it to help us make inferences and to resolve ambiguity in what we read. When we think back to the information theory we've learned, if we had limited schema, we leave a lot of ambiguity about what was meant by the words, even though we knew students knew the words. Knowledge and schemas are like a spider's web. An actual web that has more connections and links will be much stronger than a web with fewer. And they'll do a better job at catching bugs, connecting dendrites for students. The web has very few attachments, so it's more likely to break or simply doesn't have the same ability to trap any bugs that may fly into it. For instance, if high school students read a text on operant conditioning, those students who have trained their dogs are going to be more quickly able to pick up the information than those who haven't. They've already built a schema around this information and their mental spider web's well-formed. They're ready to catch related subject matter. But often, if you don't have the background knowledge, you lack the ability to relate the material to anything recognizable. The web is either non-existent or less intricate with its design, which in real life would result in a starving spider and the inability in this analogy to retain information. So how do we build schema then? How do we build knowledge at the lesson level? Building knowledge requires teachers to center the text and its meaning in the planning process. So the idea that text drive the lessons, the standards act in service of text study, and not the other way around. So we start with the text, and through study of the text itself and what students can gain from it, we practice the skills embedded within the standards. The big idea here is that we are not in the name the steps skills mastery business in reading language arts anymore. We're in the business of helping kids make meaning and analyze text that are worth thinking about and that they can learn from. By centering the text, we allow readers to build vocabulary, both through context and explicit study, that grows broad knowledge of the world through reading and allows for coherence across grades through the study of complex texts. We no longer teach main idea or inferences in isolation. Let's look at what this looks like in classrooms. So let's connect this to how it shows up in a high quality instructional materials curriculum. We've heard from a lot of schools and districts, particularly given the COVID melt, that they are working with their students to address the importance of building background knowledge. Look at these two curriculums. These are two different student experiences, both in 4th grade, student A and student B. And I want you to put in the chat, based on what you see that they would be covering in the different contents for 4th grade, which of these students would build more knowledge? Which approach, student A or student B, would allow them to build more background knowledge? Go ahead and type in the chat, A or B. Which one would give them more background knowledge? Yeah, we can see that it's B, right? Because student B, in their ELA lesson, they're reading and writing about the Earth's layers. But in science, they're learning about weathering to the Earth's surface. And in social studies, they're learning about how American Indians adapt to differences on the Earth's surface. With a high quality instructional material curriculum, it builds knowledge across the subjects so that students have a better chance of building more schema and connection in their reading because they're getting exposure to the subjects across the board. They're building background knowledge that's embedded in the approach. And something important to highlight here, it's not just in the instructional approach, this aligns with the way we are redesigning the STAAR assessment. So with STAAR, students are going to see cross-curricular content in the STAAR redesign next spring. You can see that they'll be intentionally selecting passages that cover cross-curricular content. So you have an example from grade 5, a reading language arts passage about the cholla cactus, right? With some direct connections on the right to grade 4 and grade 5 science TEKS. Students are reading about how this cactus stores water and how other animals depend on the cactus to survive in their environment. And you can see that it connects directly to the science TEKS. So even though the passage content's connected to science TEKS, students will continue to be assessed only in the RLA TEKS. This isn't an assessment of science skills, it's an assessment of literacy. So students will continue to be assessed only on the RLA TEKS, but the cross-curricular connection is to better align our test with what's happening in classrooms, which is that educators work to ensure our kids have the background knowledge they need to become strong readers and set them up for success in the rest of their lives. We're going to move on to our final RBIS here, our final research-based instructional strategy, text-based responses, in a moment. I want to pause and let you capture anything you're taking away from this section in your handout. We're going to move to our fourth one here, text-based responses. Reading, writing, and speaking, grounded in evidence from the text, both literary and informational. Let's look at what that means and why it's important. So let's start with why. Excuse me. Our goal is that we want our students to leave by the time they're done with K through 12, college, career, or military ready. However, writing and speaking grounded in the evidence from the text, we know is critical to students' literacy development for a lot of reasons. One critical one is that it prepares them for post-secondary lives, for college, for career, for military readiness. So here from this report, the Chronicle of Higher Education, where it's the college instructors shared out that identifying, evaluating, and using evidence to support or challenge a thesis, the most important skills they expect of their incoming college students. Unfortunately, high school students were rarely required to do this kind of evidence-based argument writing. Instead, they were often assigned writing that focused on offering their own opinions. So let's look at why do these text-based responses matter? I want you to take a moment, I'm going to pause here to read through these 5 key points from research on why text-based responses matter. As you look at those 5 key points, if someone asks you after this webinar, why do text-based responses matter? Which of these key points would you share with them? What do you think, what has found the most influence on your thinking as you look through these initially? Which one would you use to convince a colleague that text-based responses matter? Go ahead and type it in the chat. Strong from the weak student, the ability to cite evidence, which is a life skill, absolutely. It supports knowledge building. Yes, thank you, yes. The reciprocal processes, they work together, support each other. Let me show you the difference, right? Let me show you the difference of using a text-based response versus one that's based on personal knowledge and experience. Read through those 2 prompts on the left. Which one, the top or the bottom one, relies less on school-based instruction and more on outside of school experiences? Go ahead and put in the chat, top or bottom, which relies less on school-based instruction and relies more on outside of school experiences? Yeah, the top one, the top one. And so now, I want you to think, ask yourself, Which of these two prompts is more aligned with the writing that you've been expected to do in your adult life, in your job? Which of these prompts focuses on instruction rather than out-of-school experiences? The feedback we've gotten overwhelmingly from educators is that the second prompt is more instructionally aligned. Because think about it, in our jobs, very rarely does our boss sit there and ask us to write about our favorite vacations. But we are asked to do research or write a memo or make a recommendation based on data or research. So here's where text-dependent questions become critical. They ensure that teachers keep discussion writing grounded in the text. They are questions that can only be answered with evidence from the text. Some teachers ask students to relate texts themselves and have students share their personal views on the topic in an attempt to engage students in the topic, or because it's easier to talk about personal responses than analyze the text itself. This also happens during writing, where students are too often asked to write personal narratives about their experiences. Think about the classic, "What did you do on your summer vacation?" essay, rather than writing about something they've read. This RBIS encourages teachers to push for strong text-dependent responses when speaking and writing in class. So let's look at some examples of what this looks like in a curriculum. Using that checklist on the side of the frame in the blue box, identify whether these would be considered text-dependent questions. What's your vote? Yes or no? Would these be considered text-dependent questions? Using the criteria in that blue checkbox there? Go ahead and put in the chat. Is this a text-dependent question? Yes or no? Yeah, and I'm seeing you're identifying the key thing. Students do not necessarily need to have read the text and answer the question. Students are not asked in any of these to use evidence to support or inform their responses. And nor, frankly, do they need to create a strong response, right? Each of these asks for students' opinion or subjective thought. What do you think makes a family close-knit? That does not require a student to have actually read or cite evidence from the house on Mango Street. So let's practice. How could we revise a question? I'm going to give you one to revise in chat. How can you revise this question? Look under there. Miss Franny is very scared of Winn-Dixie at first. What's something that you used to be afraid of? What changed your mind? Go ahead and put in the chat, how would you revise this question to make it text dependent so that it could only be answered with the text and it might focus on some of the features of the text? Let's type in the chat. Revising that question from Winn-Dixie. How could we make it text dependent? What would be an example where students would have to cite evidence from the text? How does the author show that Miss Franny's scared of Winn-Dixie? Yeah. How do you describe Miss Franny's feelings towards Winn-Dixie? What clues, what clues from the text made you think this? What part of the story? Yeah. So they're having to directly go to the text to give you the evidence. These are great rewrites to make this an actual text-dependent question. Let's talk about connection to writing. So here's a revised question when I took a stab at it. Why was Miss Franny so scared by Winn-Dixie? Why was she acting all embarrassed? You notice that it completely took out what's something you used to be afraid of, what changed your mind. That could be an interesting discussion prompt for students, but it doesn't require them to grapple with the actual Winn-Dixie text and cite evidence from it. Writing is important. In very effective classrooms, students are always writing, all grade levels, all subject areas. Writing doesn't just start in 4th grade. Teachers are supporting students in becoming better readers by having them write about what they've read. And strong teachers help support students to become better readers by having students write using evidence from the texts they are reading. You know, I'm almost embarrassed to share that when I first started teaching, I had an hour for reading, I had an hour for writing, exact same students, and I kept the subjects separate instead of integrating them. What a missed opportunity to support my students. Let's look at how this concept shows up in the STAAR redesign. So in alignment with the research and stakeholder feedback, the redesigned STAAR writing prompts in all grade levels are going to ask students to write using evidence from the text to support their response. So starting next year, the redesigned STAAR will have writing prompts in all grade levels where students will read a passage and they'll write a response based on what they read. And that way, how students are reading and writing on STAAR will be better aligned to how they're learning to read and write in the classroom. Okay, we're going to go to some reflection questions in a minute. Let me pause so you can jot down your thoughts and takeaways from this final RBIS before we get to some breakout rooms and reflection opportunities. All right, so now we're going to get to some reflection and debrief. In your handout, you've got space to write down reflections. I'm going to pause here for 5 minutes to let you write down your thoughts before you're going to be sharing in breakout rooms. So 3 questions for you to consider. From what we went over today, does your LEA have a vision or a framework that's aligned to research? How does this literacy support the research strategies we talked about? How does it meet the needs of all learners in your LEA? And where do you see, sorry, this should say literacy, my apologies. Where do you see strengths or gaps in your instructional practices for literacy? All right, welcome back, everybody. It's great to see your faces after screen sharing for so long there. I'd love to, I know we were in different rooms and having conversations, but I'm gonna put myself on mute for a sec, but I'd love to have 2 or 3 folks come off mute and share something that y'all discussed in your room as you were reflecting on what you've learned from the research in best practices for literacy and as you reflect on your LEA's needs and context. So love to hear any conversations that came up in the different rooms so that everyone can benefit from each other's thinking.
Matt, I think one of the great things that's come out of the work that we've done to the Reading Academies is it is putting us in this trajectory of having some clarity around the things that we're discussing. So it sounded like just from Mrs. Gonzalez and I in our session, that has been an important framework for the work that we've been doing, but now it's like, what is that next step and getting that level of support? So we're interested in hearing more about the framework and what possible ways districts can be supported.
Love that. Thank you, Tricia. Yeah, I know many of you have been doing some pretty in-depth work with Reading Academies and your teachers and leaders as well over the last several years. And so a lot of the concepts that we touched on, particularly in foundational literacy at the beginning, probably resonated or were familiar, right? And so now it's a question of how do we help expand this to more grade levels to impact even more students once we've been able to build that foundation in our early grades? We'd love to hear any other conversations or thoughts, one or two more reflections. I'm going to mute myself if you want to come off mute and share.
I know one of the things I was discussing is we started with, given that we came out from the pandemic year, a lot of virtual learning, we had started with map assessment. So this year was more of learning what is it and, how is it that we're going to use this data to use for small group instruction. So we've gone about to revamping our scope and sequence, making sure that the teachers are well aware when small group instruction is expected or when it should be implemented with sample activities. But I think it's moving from that step as far as now I have my assessment data and my kids are in foundational skills, and how do I get them to proceed out of these foundational skills to fully, decoding and reading with fluency and comprehension. That I think most part, like is it that we help a class full of kids who are, ELs, we have special education, we have, special needs. So it's just making sure that we are providing the best for everybody, and that the students and that the teachers are well aware of how to do those grouping maths when they're doing their small group instructions to make sure that they're differentiating as they should.
Thank you, Zeta. That's a great reflection about, we know, now more than ever, right? Our students have a diverse range of needs, and COVID unfortunately exacerbated many of those. And so now, how are we going to provide a structured, strategic set of supports? And I think one thing, when I think about a high quality instructional material curriculum, one of the benefits of it, or moving towards it, is that it already builds in the research-based practices that we looked at earlier here. A lot of times you hear the phrase, we're building the plane as we fly it. But there's one industry where you never hear that phrase, the airline industry. That is not a best practice. That is not something that Boeing or Southwest would go around saying. And it's because they give their pilots the tools to be successful from the jump. It's the same when we think about what do our teachers need to set their students up for success with literacy instruction, right? Our teachers are the pilots. Let's give them a plane that already has the tools they need. Yeah, they just canceled their flights. That gives them the tools they need to be able to deliver for their students. And it already includes scaffolds that they could use if Tier 1 instruction is not meeting the needs of all their learners. It's embedded for them. And so rather than your teachers kind of scouring from scratch, and I think about, gosh, when I was first starting out teaching, I would look up resources for each specific topic, like, oh my gosh, I need to find something. How do I inferencing? How do I make an inference clear? Like, I know what I do as a reader, and I was spending so much time scouring websites that ultimately weren't aligned to the standards or weren't the most effective thing that my students needed. And so what if my time was reduced on that and was prioritized on being able to deliver instruction for my students, assess what are they getting and what do they need, and then being able to just focus more on that. And so I'm going to screen share in a sec here, turn it over to Leslie to talk about next steps for learning more about the grants. So let me do that.
Well, thank you all for joining us today, and thanks for all of you for sharing out your reflections. I just wanted to share some next steps with you all in case you want to have some more learning opportunities for the grant. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are a couple of district panels that are coming up in July and August, which are great opportunities for all of you just to hear from districts who have undergone this framework development process and learn about what are some of their successes and challenges and how their process has helped to better serve their students. We also have some upcoming research overview series specifically for math. You all weren't able to make that, and so we do have 2 more sessions, one in July and August. Again, I would like to reiterate, if any of you have any questions and you would like a one-on-one session with any of our TEA members, you can sign up for one of those sessions, and we'll be more than happy to answer your questions and talk a little bit more about the grant and how it might fit your needs. And then again, if you are interested in applying for the grant or you're ready for applying for the grant application closes July 29th. So you do have some time, and the last summer deadline will be August 26th. And so with that said, we do want to always get your feedback on these sessions. They're helpful for us in terms of like making changes and making them more, adapting them more for you all. And so if you'd like to take a little, take your camera and take a snapshot of this QR code, it'll take you to a short 2 to 3 minute survey to fill out. I'll also drop the link here in the chat. And so we can stay on for a couple of minutes to give you all just some time to fill out the survey. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So that'll bring us to a close. And let me go ahead and drop these in the chat for you all. 1 second. So I did send out the link here in the chat. If you want to take a look at that, just click it. Not a problem, Gary. Welcome, Vanessa. All right, so that brings our session to a close. Thanks again for joining, and I hope, or we hope, you have a wonderful long July 4th weekend.